All right. So Meredith, I guess the one of the first questions that I had for you was about Mixmaster. How do you feel about talking about Mixmaster, and what was your relationship to Mixmaster? Like, what was your role in it, or how did you relate to that team and that crew?
Well, I was never directly involved with Mixmaster myself, except insofar as like there was a summer of code student one summer that I think was implementing something Mixmaster related. Um, and I helped him out with some of his code questions and stuff like that. I mean, when Len and I got together in 2005, he was still operating Rancid, but it didn't see anywhere near the kind of use that it had in its heyday. He had some great stories about it, though. I mean, like he kind of had like a ranked scale of like three-letter agencies and how reasonable they were when dealing with the fact that some death threat that had been reported to their agency had come through a remailer. Like the he gave the FBI one chance. They asked him if he would come down and explain some of the technology to them, and then stuck him into the hot lights for a couple of hours. And he was like, "Yeah, I'm not falling for that twice." Um, but contrast this with like the Secret Service, who when they called him up to say like, "Hi, there's been a death threat to I'm pretty sure the president at the time this story happened was Bush. Um, you know, there's been a death threat that's come through from this IP, and Len says, "Oh, that's my remailer," and the Secret Service agent immediately says, "Cypherpunk or Type 2." So from that, it was clear that the Secret Service knew the technology, and they just had like some check boxes that they had to tick off so that they could, you know, so that they could just file the report and get on with their day.
So we noted that there was this obituary that Len wrote to Janice Jaggers. Did he ever speak about him? Like, what? Who was Janice Jaggers to the Mixmaster team? And am I even pronouncing his name right? I guess.
Oh gosh, I'm now I wonder if that was the guy that fell off the mountain.
Yeah, it was. That was the guy that fell off the mountain.
Okay, yeah. I mean, he didn't talk about him much, but he definitely used that story as a particularly harrowing example of why the bus number on a software project needs to be greater than one. Because I think it was I want to say it was like the Windows fork that he was maintaining, and when he fell off a mountain and died, like nobody else on the team had those skills.
Yeah, it's famously in computer team circles. Like we always throw that around, right? It's somebody gets hit by a bus. How are we going to keep this project going? It's either got to be documented or something else needs to be there where we have some redundancy. So yeah, that definitely resonates. But as far as like his death, you're saying he would bring this up only in the context of that, but like it didn't seem like he had a special place in the heart of the rest of the Mixmaster team. Like they didn't speak about him with some kind of reverence or anything like that.
Oh, I mean, they absolutely you know spoke respectfully about him, but I don't remember him coming up all that often. I'm also terrible with names though, so there's certainly a possibility that like he might have told me other stories, and I just didn't like connect the two people in my head. But yeah, no, the story of the guy who fell off a mountain and died is drilled into my memory.
Well, one of the things that we noticed about, and weren't sure if this was a coincidence, but the day that he died was October 31st.
Okay.
Which is the same day that the Bitcoin white paper drops. Not obviously temporarily, like different years, but the same day.
Right. Huh.
So we're looking in that, and we're saying, is there some homage that's happened here that like you have a day where you can publish the white paper, and the day you pick is October 31st. It just happens to be, in the anniversary of Janice Jagger's death.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I mean, my hunch for why the white paper was released on October 31st was that it was a one big trick or treat on the financial system.
Interesting.
I like it. I like that, a trick or treat on the financial system. You said you were in Europe now, and I know that you live in Brussels. Were you in San Francisco at that time, or had you made a move to Brussels?
In 2011?
In 2009. Because
So 2009 was when I moved to Leuven.
Pardon, you broke up there a little bit. When you moved to Belgium?
When I moved to Leuven.
Ah, Leuven.
Yeah. We lived in. I mean, Len already had an apartment there when he and I got together, and I spent like second half of 2006 through about the end of 2008, just kind of bouncing back and forth between the Bay Area and Belgium. And then in 2009, I was like, yeah, no, I need to move here full time. So, got myself legalized and got my apartment in SF.
Did he have the apartment in Belgium because there were certain people that he was trying to stay close to, like in physical proximity?
He was a student. He was working on his PhD under Bart Purnell at Kazakh. So, he had like an apartment that was about a 15-minute walk from campus.
I have when I have an opportunity to ask it, I have like a million questions around the 2006 to 2009 timeframe, around the collection of people, and I'm glad when we first started this conversation, you said you're bad with names. I'm glad to hear that, because I realized that so I'm not doxxed, and I realized that you might recognize my voice, and so I'm glad you're bad with names, because I hope you don't dox me. Go ahead.
No, I didn't say anything. Sorry, I was muted. No worries. I was just listening to you guys chatting.
So 2006 to 2009. I'm sure you remember. Like, there's like CodeCon in there. I don't know. Do you remember hanging out with?
I think I might have had some network.
Are you back?
Yeah, your audio got a little bad for a second there, Meredith. We're not sure if we actually still have you.
Hello?
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Yeah, no, I think the Wi-Fi in this hotel is just a little flaky. I've switched to 5G.
Cool. Well, it's good to have you back. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. So I was going to say 2006 to 2009. I was in the Bay Area at that time.
Mhm.
A lot of the players that were in and around the, all of the cypherpunks, all of the all the cryptography. A lot of cryptography was developed. I mean, tremendous amount of that came out of a bunch of people, a lot of names that people don't ever bring up or don't even know uh,
Mhm.
from that era. And you had CodeCon happening around there. You had a lot of. I mean, we met at some coffee shops, which I'm sure you remember. And then there was. Did you ever? I'm just curious. Did you ever go to at Sixth and Market in San Francisco? There was like a monthly meetup. Do you remember that or no?
Mm,
It was like
no.
you kind of walked toward the sketchy part of San Francisco, past the strip clubs, and there was like a little like a basement almost that everyone would kind of meet up in. That's where you had all of the people that you would you had everyone. I mean, I don't know if Bruce Schneier ever showed up there, but I know that like a ton of other people. I remember like Marcus Ranum being there, and you had people like Mike Star Trek and Doug Song, and you had like Minerva. Do you remember Minerva? Minerva was there all the fucking time. And so it was an interesting time in the Bay Area because it's almost like when I think of Bitcoin, I think of multiple disciplines having to have come together, right? You've got cryptography, you've got
Absolutely.
banking, you've got finance, you've got this
Game
strange,
theory.
yeah, game theory. You've got the code itself is even like so I remember when the original and Grant took a look at it recently as well, so he can confirm this. I remember when the original code came out, there were some ways in which memory was being handled in the code that was very um, so at the time there was no GitHub, there was no Stack Overflow, open source. You couldn't just go out and find some open source cryptographic algorithm. I mean, Blowfish existed and Twofish, but other algorithms
Right.
didn't
And
really
there was
exist.
SourceForge, but there was SourceForge, but yeah, like OpenSSL was maintaining their own CDS servers and stuff like that.
Exactly. And so you go back and you look at the source code for Bitcoin and you think to yourself, if you're me, you think to yourself, okay, how in the hell in 2009 could somebody have had access to this level of advanced code? Like where must they have been? Who must they have known? And how would they even have access to build some of? Because Grant, weren't you talking about like boosts and pointers? I mean, what the hell? Like that
Yeah,
wasn't a thing in 2009.
But I mean,
right.
Boost was used in everything. I mean, I was using C++ and Objective C++ professionally around that time because
See that you nailed it though. Objective C. Those are the people that were using Boost, but it wasn't like super common in C or C++ at the time.
I mean, like auto pointer had made it into TR1 by then. Like I was using TR1 in the C++ code that I was writing for Sagato, and the Objective C was just like the front end shit. But yeah, like I used the fuck out of Boost in
Well, but Meredith, wouldn't you
Nautilus,
consider
the database thing I did.
wouldn't you consider yourself to be a better C++ programmer? I guess that's where we were trying to go with this. Is this that Boost was not necessarily super penetrated into the entire world of C++. I think some people knew about it, and we're lasering in on Boost as being something that being used in the Bitcoin code base at that point seems pretty
In open
cutting edge.
source code.
Yeah.
I mean, like, yes. I was definitely one of the, like, I'm the kind of person who, considers Alexandrescu to be bedtime reading. But, I want to say it was even in 2006, come to think of it, that I wrote a little piece on my live journal that was kind of a parody of that "Wear Sunscreen" poem/song from a while back. But it was, my advice to the computer science graduating class of this year: use smart pointers.
100%. But
So-
like just starting to dissect the different pieces of technology required to have come together in the Bitcoin code base. It's the fact that it's hardened from a security perspective, that it's using advanced C++. It has a communication protocol.
The fact that the mad genius who wrote it came up with a whole ass VM and then stripped it down to like 4 instructions, because he was like, we can add the rest of these back in once we're confident once we're confident that the very baseline ones are working properly. Like, that's some fucking security mindset there.
Yeah, and I just look, because I worked, for those of us who were like, working with, for those of us who had Bjorn Strostrup on speed dial, right? Like, we were super familiar with some of this, but I want to just set the Wayback Machine and like really walk you through. So like TR1, which is a technical report that was really the first place that like the normal humans started to see like the beginning of what would become Boost, which is what we're calling smart pointers and function objects and all this stuff that kind of became the standard. That was TR1. That was in like 2005, 2006, right? But I was
using several of the like Boost container libraries in 2005 when I was working on when I was working on the what the fuck were those exams called? My qualifying exams. I basically did a project for my qualifying exams. So like I used the shit out of Boost tuple for that one.
Right. And like I wrote Go in 2007, right? So like, I mean, we can, this isn't the point that I'm making. I think you were way ahead of the curve. The point that I'm making is, I just want to point out that it was like, it wasn't until 2011 that the standardized Boost came out with C++. It was 2011. And so you were
definitely, everybody was definitely compiling their own Boost back then. Yeah,
there you go. That's where I was getting to. So my point about some of the technology and in the original, the original Bitcoin. So first of all, there's some idiosyncrasies in there that are like really interesting. But my point is, like, you're talking about something that in 2009 had what became in 2011 a bunch of standardized library. I mean, so you're talking about something that was, several years ahead of standardization, and that leads me to the second part of it, which is that in 2011 I had, and Grant, I apologize for this, but I am actually getting somewhere with it. In 2011, I had a company that had a bunch of server racks at, where we had 40U of 1U Celeron systems, blah, blah, blah. And in 2011, early 2011, I repurposed those systems to start mining Bitcoin. So I started mining Bitcoin around February of 2011. Now, one of the things I want to point out for those who weren't around during that time is that even in early 2011, solving the hash and getting the Bitcoin reward at that time was still, in 2011, with a lot of compute power, was still difficult. And so what I've been trying to figure out, and perhaps you can help me with this, is I've been trying to figure out, like, is there someone somewhere early on that had a knowledge of ASICs or FPGAs or had some hardware knowledge for solving these blocks, because the number of those, what we're calling the Satoshi era wallets, the number of solves that had happened, in those first couple of years it's an irrational number relative to the compute power that it would have required to do so, especially as you start talking about getting into like early 2011. So do you remember anyone in that time like having like what it would be like an outsized amount of dedicated compute power for some of this? You see where I'm going with this. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the only people I can think of that had access to that kind of compute power just, at a snap of the fingers were feds, of one style or another. Like I'm counting people who like teach at the Naval Postgraduate School to be feds.
So I want to throw out a name. I want to throw out a name that I've never, not one time in the history of histories, heard anyone mention. And we talked about Blowfish earlier a little bit for a minute. And that name is Bruce Schneier, who wrote Applied Cryptography.
Oh yeah.
I know you know who that is. So like, my question is, and you've got Dan Kaminsky and all those guys around there. My question is, do you think it's possible that Bruce had a hand in the early development, or at least the implementation and some of the work when the white paper came out and Bitcoin started to take off? Because for some reason I have it's got like a whiff of Bruce Schneier on some of the, and he had, by the way, he had access to that, right? If you think about like, this is somebody who, he's a board member on Tor. He helped with the Tor project. Like I say, was very involved in like Blowfish, Twofish, Helix, the stream cipher. And he was in the Bay Area.
I can definitely see your perspective there. I've never looked at any of Bruce's code, so I can't really like deliver any input there. But certainly in terms of like people who would have the resources to, pull in specialists to do like isolated bits of things that that he wasn't necessarily prepared to do himself. But like in terms of theoretical knowledge, yeah, and you bring up some really solid points there.
And Bruce, if you remember, and we talked about this before you popped on, but Bruce was a big fan of Claude Shannon, and Bruce was one of the first persons that, like, from 1999 until 2005 was banging a drum about something called Kirchhoff's principle, which, if you're not familiar with it, in security, there's basically security through obscurity, and then there's this thing called Kirchhoff's principle. And Kirchhoff's principle, nobody had ever really built something. I mean, Blowfish might be probably the closest thing that originally had this. And you probably are familiar with OpenBSD and Theo and all the stuff that was done. And Bruce was pretty heavy-handed in that as well. With what became OpenSSH and OpenSSL and all of those things. But the Kirchhoff's principle is this idea, and I'm bringing this up for a reason because I think you'll find this interesting. Kirchhoff's principle is this idea that a cryptographic system should be secure even if every single thing about that system except the private key is public knowledge. So Kirchhoff's principle is this idea that like the cryptographers embraced wholeheartedly, which is like, instead of security through obscurity, if you have fully open source software, it still should be uncrackable because the public knowledge of all of the source code, blah, blah, blah.
He's been a huge champion for that, and it runs all through applied cryptography. Yeah,
of course it does. Now here's the point that I'm getting to, though, which is, I think, fascinating, which is, as far as I can tell, Bitcoin is the only, for a very long, now it's not true, but for a long time, from 2009 forward, Bitcoin was the only system that I think actually fully met Kirchhoff's principle. It was fully open source, it was fully known, it was fully vetted, it was fully distributed, it was fully shared, it was public knowledge on a public ledger, and every single thing about the
What about
system was
Tor?
known, but it was uncrackable. And
What
still
about Tor?
is. Well, I mean, Tor wasn't. I mean, yeah. So see, this is where we go back to Bruce again, right? I mean,
Sure.
because he was intimately involved in Tor as well, and so you're literally talking about two systems where one person was and Kaminsky was involved in Tor a little bit, and then you go back and you could, like, Mike Stolarczyk was involved in Tor, Doug Song was involved in Tor, was Doug involved? I mean, there's some DNA shared between these two projects that I've never heard anyone publicly speak about. But I actually think it's also possible that I mean, well, there weren't a lot. I want you to go back and think about the Paranoia remailer and think, like, how many people were even on that list? It couldn't have been, like, it had to be less than 100. Like, there weren't that many people that were there,
Yeah. No, like the field itself was small at the time. Like 2006 to 2008 was kind of a shady time for business in the Bay Area. I know, I was trying to raise funds.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think about, when did Tor became, so this is, Grant, I don't know if you know this, but, like, Tor, was worked on for a really long time, like starting in the early 2000s. It got a little bit popular because the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, began supporting some of the development through grants. But it wasn't really until, and this is so ironic, it was the Arab Spring activists in 2010, which was very close to the release of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And between that in 2010, and then, of course, Snowden's disclosures in 2013, which is what created the real public awareness. And ironically, that coincided with a big surge in Bitcoin. And these things are very parallel when you think about this, Kirchhoff's principle. It's interesting that you had two systems that had largely the same players, had largely the same, like, DNA on how they were, not what they were doing, but how they were designed. And if you look at the code between the two, they share DNA in that respect as well, which is super fascinating to me.
So the supposition kind of going that there had to have been a team that was working together. And in some of the emails that have been dropped as post the Satoshi or the Craig Wright Satoshi trial, there are places where the person who's in control of the Satoshi email says that the system had been worked on by us for something like 18 months to 2 years before they actually released the white paper.
Yep.
And the question is then, is that, the plural us or the royal us?
Well, when you start thinking about the number of disparate pieces of technology, the level of sophistication that you have to pull off some of these things, I mean, security hardening is its own discipline, as you well know. Just to say,
oh, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, just think about, like, you'd have to be good at that, and then you'd have to, like, know all of this hash cache stuff. You'd also have to know all of the communication peer-to-peer stuff that Bram had been pioneering in BitTorrent. I mean, there's so many different.
You need to have read basically all of Ross Anderson's entire CD.
Right. So this is where we've been, speculating that it's a team of people that was working together. And so this is why we're kind of curious about the Mixmaster team, because Mixmaster was busy. It was something that was happening quite a bit. And they're presenting at DEF cons and code cons and whatever. And then did it just stop, like, altogether when this project started getting worked on?
I remember visiting one of the other Mixmaster devs, and I'm blanking on his name, but he was a co-author on the Echolon Looked For paper, and he's Austrian. So like I remember, like visiting him a couple of times, and like they get to talking about pingers, and like sometimes I would follow the conversation and sometimes not so much. So like there was still development um, going on, although it more maintenance-y development. Like the Type 3 remailer kind of never happened. I mean, I guess like Mixed Minion sort of happened, but you know, by that point, I think um, you know, Tor had really started to take the lead. Like people were more interested in a general purpose anonymizing Zox proxy than in uh, than in a high latency remailer system, which is really kind of a shame because the low latency of Tor is ironically the thing that makes correlation attacks possible from a sufficiently large passive local observer.
And this is something Len spoke about quite a bit, when he said, what's the best way to hide on the remailer is you need regular traffic. You have to have traffic that looks very normalized. If you don't have, if you have too many nodes, it's easy to fingerprint people who are on specific nodes. There were, where he was mentioning if you have 20, that's pretty good. 50 is way too much because there's not actually enough, and that spam isn't an issue on remailers. So this idea that Bitcoin was born out of the desire to stop spam on remailers seems to not fit with the actual traffic patterns of what was occurring on Mixmaster and other types of remailers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by, we've talked, and I know we're talking a lot about like the early, but I mean, you have unique insight into some of this early, and you're also technically sophisticated enough to understand it, which makes you a very unique human, just so you know. You already know
Thank
that.
you.
But so if you think about, we have this really fascinating situation where we are saying there are less than 100 people who are on the Senshi and the Paranoia remailers who are on those early cypherpunk mailing lists. 2 of them are on this call talking to each other, which is insane. And we're talking about like, it's greater than 1% of the cypherpunk mailing list is on this conversation. That is crazy to think about. And so I started thinking about things like, we talked about, we talk about Nick Szabo a lot, right? We talk about the bit gold concept. We talk about, creator of B money, which is wide eye. We talk about, obviously you can't bring this up without Adam Back, who was Hashcash. But then you start getting into, people we don't talk about. I mean, I guess people talk about Gavin a little bit, and Mike Hearn sometimes, but I don't hear, there's a bunch of, not a bunch, but there's a handful of other names. I mentioned Mike Stolarczyk. I don't know. Do you remember MTS on the site? That was Mike. So.
Oh, okay.
Right. So fucking Mike Stolarczyk, MTS, was like probably one of the most brilliant cryptographers I've ever met in my entire life, and I met a lot. And MTS, if you go back to the to the mailing list, Mike was the one that talked a lot about. He and Doug talked a lot about inflationary versus deflationary supplies, right? And so it was very controversial at the time for Bitcoin to have a fixed supply of 21 million. And Grant, I know you've seen because of the dipshit trial where he claims to be Satoshi. I know you've seen like a lot of the documents, a lot of the personal emails from that remailer came out. And you remember that whole conversation about fixed supply and how many is it going to be? And what does this mean for proof of work? And what does this mean for the basic laws of thermodynamics and trying to solve for the hash and the halvening and, and what does this mean for the time between blocks? And
and some of the glib comments like, oh, it could be 21 million or maybe 42 million is a good number, and then doing the math on why it's 21 million and it coming out to like relatively round numbers, it seemed like there was some evidences in the emails talking about like how did this number actually come about and why was it chosen. It wasn't like some deep numerical thing, but rather like fit that idea of it's a nice round number that kind of works out backwards if you back calculate it from something that else that I was trying to achieve.
Well, and 42 million came about because, duh, it's 42. It's the ultimate answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, right? Like, so, and so, like, well, maybe it's half that. It was almost like you said, it's like they backed into it as a joke because it was meant to be 42 originally. Which,
yeah, no, you're absolutely right that there's loads of people, who. Some of whom were avid participants, some of whom were more just readers. Who've gone on to do some really, some extremely rad things. They just haven't been like, they just don't tend to brag about it. I'm thinking about people like David Molnar, who I think he and Len and Ryan Lackey were the youngest people on the list back in the 90s. Like they were all 15 at the same time.
And so this goes back to something that you said, Grant, which is like, it is impossible for Satoshi to have been a single, individual, because of just you think about, it's like saying one person created Tor, right? Like the amount, the number of disciplines that had to come together in order to make this work. And even looking at the code, the amount of, you can just look at the code and see that it has the fingerprint of at least, 3 or 4 different, and by different, I mean truly different individuals, right? Like, and so one of the things we talked about before you popped on, Meredith, is like Grant had, and I did this with some code back in the day too. Grant had the pleasure, I say pleasure, Grant, of having had to go through some code and like kind of modernize it, to make the pointers more efficient and all that.
I had to do that.
Yeah. Like I had the great opportunity to go through an entire code base comprehensively and convert it from having naked pointers to smart pointers, and that these types of efforts are, they're massive, and they take quite a bit of thoughtful going through, especially just to get it.
Well, and so my point is, like, it feels go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, at Nuance, I got to update a rather large C++ code base from C++ 98 to C++ 17.
So that's where we're thinking about the number of unique skill sets that come together, and there being evidences for this in the code base, as well as this idea that, at the time, being exposed to the types of code that you would need to see to be able to get good at this stuff. Like, who had the opportunity to see the code that you would need to be able to write this in the way that it was written? Like, who had access to those private repos, and who is in the right place at the right time to have been exposed to this? And it just seems implausible that a single individual could have had access to the disparate code bases that would have all been locked behind in the private worlds that existed during that time of when development was happening.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Bruce more and more, because I'm thinking like, somebody with their hands in standards bodies.
Right? And with access to that level of hardware too.
Yeah.
Right, because the line of
No,
thinking there
that's
goes, if you're going to solve that many blocks, if you're going to win that many blocks, how much compute resources do you need to have at the times when those blocks are being won? And given the frequency of winning, what would you have had access to in some sense to be able to pull off that mining effort?
yeah. And Bruce, I think, is canny enough to have destroyed the Satoshi wallet. Like if it was Bruce, like he'd understand the the deflationary advantage of doing that.
And he also, ironically, had just sold his company
So it's like he didn't have to worry about money.
for a legitimate amount of capital. I remember when it happened. I mean, and so, this would have been around 2010, 2011, right? Like I said, and he would eat, maybe he didn't see that it was going to be, $70,000 per coin or whatever it was, but like, it almost makes too much sense that he would have had the resources, the means, the team, access to, the hardware. Like I said, I feel like there's some FPGAs involved here, and that he would have.
Wonder if anybody's ever asked him.
Jump started. I imagine he would say no. I can ask him, but he would have jumped. I just started thinking about this after your interview because I posted. I don't know if you follow me on Twitter, but I posted Len Sassaman is Satoshi, and here's why. IP address tracks back to Belgium. He liked to use the word U. He liked to use the letter U in color. He had the skill set. Blah 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 blah. I posted that like 2 years ago, and again last year for my around my birthday just to remind people because I thought it was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been thinking a lot since all since the HBO mockumentary came out, and since
The mockumentary, I love it.
Since people have been talking about, I mean, now Len has some traction, right? And I've been thinking like, well, Len's a person, sure, but like there's still like some missing pieces, right? Okay, we can track the IP to Belgium, and we can, and as far as I know, I'm the first person that like showed like, here are the timestamps, and here's what time it was in Belgium, and here's the IP address, and it's very plausible that this guy was writing some of this. Of course, there were other people in Belgium at the time. I think that's why Grant started asking about the remailer team and who else is in Belgium, because and
Gotcha.
yeah, so we start.
Yeah,
and so
I
anyway,
mean,
I
like,
started thinking about like who had, and because it had to be somebody with tremendous resources to get all of those Satoshi era wallets as quickly and efficient. I mean, some of the solves happened. Go back and do the math. Some of the solves happened on a timeline and in a way that like was just not possible using a CPU at the time.
I've not done that math. I should go and do that.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about OPSEC for a second. So the entire Mixmaster team is talking about privacy and anonymity, and one of the things that you even brought up was you have to be diligent. You can't be sloppy, right? If you're sloppy, if you make a mistake, one mistake doxes you. One mistake can bring the whole thing down. And this is partly also, in the conversation of remailers, why the traffic has to look so regular, right? If the traffic doesn't look regular, you can't hide in it. It's like a school of fish, right? If you're in a school of fish and all the fish are the same size and they're all swimming around, you can hide in that school. But if you're a big fish and you swim off to the right and the pack swims left, then you're out there and you're going to get eaten by a shark. Like you're doxed, you're out of the normal course. And I think that's why, when Len was talking about is spam an issue on remailers, it's like, well, you can't hide if you're spamming, because we would all know it's that guy that's spamming, like, and he'd stick out like a sore thumb. So you want regular traffic and you want this.
Right.
And so it all comes back to this idea of OPSEC. And so when you started talking about the fact that Len had these multiple laptops. I'm like, if I was going to try to protect an identity because I was part of a team or whatever, I would want a laptop that was completely isolated from everything else I was doing, so I could maintain that I wasn't going to errantly make a mistake, do something when I was drunk or whatever. Like, and I'm not saying Len was a drinker or anything like that, but I'm just saying
this was a series of laptops. This was like, 5 or 6 laptops over the course of like, 7-8 years. So like,
right, and that's what happens, as a technologist. Like, I've probably got 20 laptops and they're scattered all over the house, but I'm saying this maintaining like complete separation, OPSEC, that being so important, right? And because a lot's been made about, well, Satoshi had this.
I when I travel, if I'm, if I'm currently, I'm a freelancer, but like, if I'm working for a company and have a company laptop, I will travel with a briefcase with 2 laptops in it. And that's really just kind of professional courtesy, more so than OPSEC. But ironically, I think that's kind of a thing that points to it being less likely that it was Len, because he really tried to minimize the amount of stuff that he traveled with, because his back was super fucked up from years and years of prednisone, and he couldn't carry. He couldn't carry like too much stuff. Otherwise, he'd fuck his back up even worse. Like, when we traveled together, I typically got to carry everything. So
I remember that I've traveled very light. I'm maybe the lightest traveler you've ever met. And I remember having this conversation in San Francisco one time because we were both trying to figure out what laptop we could put in one of those Timbuktu messenger bags, the smaller ones, and still have all of our other stuff. Like, we had an entire conversation about like, how would you organize one of the smaller Timbuktu messenger bags? And then I have an extra vertebrae at the base of my spine, which is totally fine. But about once every 6 years, what happens is it pinches, like it kinks.
That sounds awful.
Yeah, and so like it pinches my sciatic, so it's either on the left or the right hand side. And so I had that entire conversation with him, and another buddy of mine has a degenerative spinal issue, guy John Foster, and we had this whole conversation around how much weight was too much weight, whether a messenger bag was better than a backpack, how little you could travel with. So anyway, I find, I love this walk a little bit down memory lane, because like I say, there were like fucking 100 people that could have this conversation. And it's fascinating to me to think like, so this grant kind of flies in the face of some of the other speculation that people have about like, oh, Len had 42 laptops and he carried them everywhere. And,
Yeah, no, he did. If anybody was lugging the stuff, it was me, and I would know, because sometimes I would just fucking look in a bag and be like, what is all this shit in here? But it was never 2 laptops. Speaking of laptops, though, have you checked out any of the GPD series? They're this Chinese manufacturer, and they make these itsy bitsy little laptops, like smaller than a tablet. And I've been using one of those as a travel machine for a while, in a messenger bag kind of thing. The one I have is from Longchamp, but it's great because I can sling it. I can sling it crossbody, or I can cinch up the strap and wear it like at my waist, just depending on how I want to distribute the weight.
I've been rocking since right before COVID a ThinkPad X1 Nano. which is 1.98 pounds with
Ooh,
effectively a 14-inch screen. And one of the reasons it's not very fast, but I've been using it and I'm very happy with it. And one of the, what I found was that an iPad with a keyboard weighs more than this laptop, which is very interesting when you
fascinating.
think about it. And it's very thin and very small, but it has one feature that I think is going to, aside from it runs Linux, which is a requirement for me, it has one feature that I think you're going to find super wild, which is, are you ready for this? It has a slot for a 4G. It basically has a slot for a 4G or a 5G cellular modem. How crazy
Oh,
is
nice.
that? So then you don't have to worry about being on
That's
public
awesome.
Wi-Fi. So that's actually like, if I had to,
Right, right.
yeah. So lightweight and and you have your own. I use Molvad VPN, and I'm not a moron, right? So like I use
Right,
VPNs a
right.
lot, but still, like you're in a public space. Even if you're using a VPN, you're on Wi-Fi. You're still, you still have to connect to that network, and
Right, right.
there are, as we both know, there are some people who have some techniques that we may not be familiar with. And so
Yes.
I'm not interested in any kind of public, uh, connect to any kind of public network if I can avoid it. So.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense. The GPT-2, I just looked it up, by the way. The GPT-2 Pocket weighs 465 grams, so right about a pound.
Oh, that's crazy.
But
I'm
it's a much smaller.
I'm DMing you right now to get
Okay.
to get the link.
Meredith, I wanted to ask a question about CodeCon 2009. Does that one stick out in your mind at all? Like, this would have been after the white paper drops. Like, is everybody talking about Bitcoin at this conference? Like, is there a buzz of Bitcoin fervor that's happening?
I was actually not at that one. That was during the year that I spent as the world's least interesting international fugitive. So I was not traveling to the U.S. at the time, and Len flew solo for that one.
Well, in your conversations with Len, was he mentioning it? Like, was it something that came up in conversation? Did he mention projects or things that he thought were interesting? Because at this time, Bram would have been fairly successful in stuff that he was doing. Was he still organizing and helping with it, or had he not really involved with it at that point?
He was still helping, but he'd taken a bit of a step back because he was pretty busy with BitTorrent. There were so like Len and Jonathan were Jonathan was Jonathan Moore, I think was his last name. And he was kind of the silent partner. But he was the one that was responsible for things like making sure they had enough chairs for everybody. The things you really want to have to make sure your conference runs. No, I mean, what I remember Len being most talkative about, in our phone conversations during that time, he was really excited about the fact that they had a biohacking track, because that was the first there hadn't really been any biohacking conferences at that point. So they decided to specifically solicit on the DOI bio list, and so they got pretty sure I remember Tito Jankowski giving one of the talks. I'd have to look at the schedule to remember the rest of them, but no, he was just stoked that that other people were excited about the biohacking stuff too.
Interesting. I'd forgotten about that.
That was also the same year that Zuko took an axe to a laptop on stage. I was watching the stream when that happened.
Yeah, that was also the year that at the after party, we snuck into the rooftop of the salon. Do you remember the salon.com? They bought the whole electronic link. We snuck onto the roof of the salon party, and there were a bunch of like people from Burning Man and Salon and all that there. And there was I don't know, do you remember DJ High Bias? He like showed up with his stuff and just started DJing on the roof of almost a party that was crashed. I sent Grant a photo of a bunch of us standing outside before we went up
That's
to
great.
that.
You just like brought your own party.
Yeah, we just like literally it was BYOP for which and so I thought that was interesting because that was the first time like I'd been going to DEF CON since like I think the second one. I don't think I got the first one. It was either the second or third, but I've been going to DEF CON for a long time. And that was the first conference, CodeCon 2009 was the first conference where like it had like those old school DEF CON vibes where it was like a lot of like it was really close, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of impromptu. The schedule was was a suggestion,
right.
like DEF CON, and so it was. And I was living at the time. I was living in San Francisco. I was south of Market, and it was like it was kind of weirdly transformative for me as far as like, oh wow, we're bringing back like all the stuff that I love about, you've got hackers, you've got, hackers and painters and biohacking, like you said, which I'd forgotten about. And it was just like a really interesting, very cross-disciplinary. So I think, Grant, that's why you're latching onto it, is because it's one of the very few times where it's called CodeCon, but there was a lot of disciplines. I don't think I've seen anything like that since then, where you have that many different people from different places, and it was just kind of a weird sort of magical thing.
I can think of one event that has managed to capture that vibe, and there needs to be more of them because there is a literal RFC for it. PXE, the Phenolite Exchange event. Felix Lindner, like FX, wrote an RFC for a conference where everyone is a speaker. You apply by submitting an abstract for like a 10 to 15 minute talk, and the goal of the event is to saturate the information graph. Give your talk to everyone else and hear everyone else's talk.
Crazy.
So instead of there being a stage, you have like a lot of round tables and like comfy places to sit and like an outdoor area where people can smoke and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that is definitely old school, like DEF CON vibes, where it was like the hackathons and the round tables, and you got people like Mudge and all those guys hanging out. I was looking at PXE. My plan was to go. It's so funny that you mention it, but it looks like they canceled it.
So FX had a cerebral aneurysm back in 2016, and hasn't really, like, he's doing a lot better now. Like he's almost fully recovered, but he hasn't really like had the wherewithal to to run another conference. That said, the reason why he wrote the RFC in the first place was so that anybody else could do the same thing. And in fact, my friend that I was just at dinner with, he's a Berlin local, and like this guy and I had thrown a homotopy type theory workshop at TU Berlin. I want to say in like 2015. I don't remember exactly when it was, but we had just like gotten one of the authors of the homotopy type theory book to fly out to Berlin and like spend a week teaching us. And so like as we were walking back from dinner tonight, he was saying we should do another workshop one of these days. And I was like, yeah, we should come up with a talk. We should come up with a topic, or we could just do a PXE. And he was like, yeah, let's do that. So like 2025, it's happening. We're bringing it back.
Oh yeah, so I'm down 100% for that, because I think
Fantastic.
that's something that's absolutely sorely missing, is that, like, say, that level of camaraderie and where everyone gets. I mean, PumpCon was a little bit like that, but PumpCon's not really much of a thing anymore.
Yeah,
I was trying to remember.
HushCon is a little HushCon East more so than HushCon West, but HushCon kind of has that vibe too.
Yeah, and I was trying to remember 2013, 14. I'm trying to remember if we bumped into each other at in Amsterdam at Hack in the Box.
I don't think I made it to Hack in the Box either of those years.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what year that was. Maybe it was before. I can't remember. But...
Meredith, you mentioned, or I know that you worked on a CBDC for East Timor.
Yes.
And as you guys are taking a tour through memory lane, through the camaraderie of San Francisco before, there was more happened than just the Bitcoin dropping in 2008, 2009. Like, rents started to skyrocket. People were already aware that quantitative easing was a thing, a real thing, and that the effects that it was going to have were inevitable. When you, I guess one question is, like, how was the experience in creating a CBDC or a digital currency for a nation state? It's something that I think a lot of us dream about. We dream about maybe the ability to choose to enter into that system, but it would be an equally strong solution. Well, I don't know. So maybe some people who realize, like, CBDCs seem to get this very bad name in the world of crypto today, but it's one way to prevent a central bank from artificially inflating and surreptitiously taking advantage of the people of that country. But when you look at cryptocurrencies and where they're at today, what do you think? Do you think there's hope? Are we at a pivot point, or I don't know? What are your thoughts there?
Well, the genie is not going back in the bottle. I don't see that happening. Just full stop. Cryptocurrencies exist, and I think as we start to see more and more CBDCs roll out, and I just want to clarify, right? Like, Carton Ballet was not like bespoke designed for East Timor specifically. It was designed for it was designed for disaster relief scenarios. The idea being that an aid agency could distribute money in this fashion, and Emerson Tan, the founder, through I want to say it was through World Vision International. I was never very clear on like what all of the kind of like NGO relationships were, but that was mainly because they bored me to tears. So yeah, like I'm sure Emerson could go on at much greater length about that entire process of rolling out rolling out a CBDC, and I would be happy to hit him up for you if you'd be interested in having him on. I'd come back to that.
I would love, yeah, definitely love that.
Okay, yeah, I'll hit him up.
Well, and I guess I made, I guess I made an assumption there too. When you were drawn into the cypherpunk movement, did you have an eye on cryptocurrencies? Like, there's also seems to be this strange arc of in which they were popular and there was a buzz about them, and that had been waning at the time that Bitcoin was that Bitcoin came onto the scene. And you guys are all programmers. I was a hippie who was in and out of San Francisco at the time. It was something that certainly was on my radar, but the chefs were in the kitchen, and we were waiting at the table. Um,
Well, Len always described me as having married into the cypherpunks, which is accurate. I came to the Bay Area in January 2006, fresh out of grad school, having just rage quit my PhD. And he also said it was a little bit like marrying into the mafia. Like, weird things are going to happen in your life, but people are going to take care of you. Um, and no lies detected. That is in fact how things have played out. So he called it.
fast forward, I mean, you've been in the scene, and there was obvious. Uh, what was your view, or what did you I don't know what did you see when you looked at that cyberpunk movement? Was that what they were focused on? Were they focused on cryptocurrency? Were they focused on privacy?
I think they were much more focused on privacy. I
And
mean, and that could just be because of like the subset of of cypherpunks who I encountered in real life. But because I've never met Tim May, for example. Like, there's lots of people I haven't met. I live in a hole with a rock on top of it. But uh, certainly, the impression I had always had, uh, as this outsider brought in, was that the focus was on privacy and anonymity.
and I guess that also brings me to, we talked about the different areas of expertise that were necessary for something to be created like Bitcoin. But one, and mind, I guess I was also very interested in it because in 2006 I was in Argentina, and when the economic collapse and the
Mm-hmm.
hyperinflation was
Mm-hmm.
occurring in Argentina, I was living with two Germans, and one of them worked for SAP. We were digital nomads with our Timbuktu bags. I can't believe y'all brought up Timbuktu. Um,
Hey, Alice, do
but
you
that
remember Craig Citifer?
no, that one not on my radar. I'm not that cool. Um, but
So Cragen was also in the Bay Area around that time.
Yeah, yeah.
And he moved to Argentina. Him and Beatrice, and then they split up, but they're both still there. He's done some work for me off and on over the years, and it is literally easier for me to pay him, you know, and for him to pay his landlord his rent in Bitcoin than it would be for my company to transfer Argentinian currency through the traditional fiat system.
Oh, absolutely.
International remittance, it's like one of the key features of Bitcoin. When I was working at Exodus,
Mhm.
that we had a distributed team all across the world, and we would do payroll in Bitcoin, where everybody would throw an address up there and they'd say, all right, we're going to pay whatever address you want to get paid to, there you go, and they would run payroll, and there was no way we could have done that without Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have
No,
the
there's so
same
many, there's
issue
so many,
with
there's
my
so
with
there's
the
so many,
project I'm working on now. Yeah.
there's so many middlemen in the global fiat system, and they all want their piece of the pie.
So Lucas, if you don't have any follow-ups, I don't know how much longer this is going to go. So I want to make sure we get to this before we.
I am starting to fade here. It's
So
it's
so before we
10:30. So
exit, do you mind? I want to pivot a little bit, and I want to talk about Meredith, the person, and I want to talk a
okay.
little bit about like. So you are, and I said this at the beginning, and I mean it. You know, you are accomplished, knowledgeable. You know, you're quite a force in your own right, which I think sometimes people lose track of that. And I don't see you. I see you as a fully formed human. Like I see you as a three-dimensional person. And what I want to talk about is I want to talk about. It's a little bit of a touchy subject, but I think it's really interesting, and I think people will respond to it because there is a human on the other side of this conversation. And I want to talk about you have been involved for a very long time, 2006, right? You've
Mhm.
been involved within a group where it is surrounded by the craziest shit that has happened to probably, you know, any small group of people, but it's also surrounded by tragedy and by, you know, you've been through a lot, quite just in an insurmountable in some ways amount that most of us can't comprehend, right? And I want to talk about like what is your life, do you have fond memories? What is your life like now? Tell me a little bit about you as a person so we can kind of end this by like getting to know the fully formed human on the other side of this conversation, if that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, these days, like I play a lot of music. You know, I picked up bass like uh back in I guess about 2010 ish. You know, and have have been kind of slowly expanding my collection of stringed instruments. Like I've picked up a violin, I picked up classical guitar recently. Um, you know, and I'm not great at it, but being great at it isn't the point. You know, it's playing with stuff and discovering interesting things. You know, like
Have you read Gödel Escher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter?
yes,
You know,
that's a good one.
that and Hackers and Painters by Paul Graham. You know, I mentioned Hackers and
Hmm.
Painters earlier. Those are it makes me realize how many people are extraordinarily technical. You know, so I'm on the spectrum, you're on the spectrum,
Hmm.
but like
Oh
one
yeah.
thing I said to somebody the other day was like, aren't we all on the spectrum? I mean, it's called the spectrum. like by definition, we're all on it, you know, on it. So, but it is interesting
Oh,
to me how. Go ahead.
I absolutely think that far more people than are aware of it, you know, have the kinds of sensory hyperacuities or hypoacuities that are characteristic of being on the autistic spectrum. You know, I have terrible vision, but a ridiculously acute sense of hearing. Like, you know, my girlfriend will be like talking on the phone with her mom and not be on speaker, and like she'll end up having to just put the conversation on speaker anyway because I'll hear the entire conversation and like start chiming in. Like I don't try to do this. I can hear I can hear conversations through walls. It's kind of not great sometimes, but it's crazy bad hearing, and so that makes music fun.
Absolutely, and and I do, you know, that is interesting. So I'm loud noises, but there's this very specific pitch, and it's almost like impossible for me to maintain my composure at a certain level, uh, which I think is, you know, characteristic. I mean, there's, you know, it's almost a cliche at this point.
Sure.
And I'm like, certain clothes, right?
Hmm.
Like there's certain fabrics that I find impossible.
Certain fabric textures, certain food textures. Like I absolutely cannot handle the texture of eggs.
Give me an example of a texture of food that you can't handle. Like what's a food that you're like, absolutely not?
Eggs. I cannot handle the texture of eggs. I don't care how they're cooked.
They're too rubbery. Give me the, like, what's the sensory input problem with eggs?
There is a rubberiness to them. Something about the way that they come apart. Like, you know, I want my protein to be chewy like meat is.
Are you familiar with Fuchsia Dunlop?
No.
So
Is that a
Fuchsia,
person?
yeah, she's a food critic and a food writer, and it specializes in Chinese cuisine, Chinese food, and I find it interesting. She once said, I was listening, or no, reading, listening, I'm not sure which, but she said in China there's a very different concept of experiencing food, and it's about both how it feels in the moment and how you will feel in the future. And so in China, you know, you don't say tastes good, tastes bad. You say feels good, feels bad, and how boo how. And I'm, you know, when I'm trying to, well, sometimes when I'm listening to my tongue and its desire for sugar, I just say, how will I feel in the future? This will not feel good in the future, and I try to put myself of that mindset. But I find it funny that you also say eggs are sometimes distasteful. There are times whenever I love eggs, and times whenever I, you know, pinch my nose and crease my brow, and nothing. Just what you say. They don't. There's something very foreign about them.
Well, I can't. I'll never ever be able to eat an egg again without thinking it's like an ectoplasm or something because of the way it's constructed. So now I think you may have ruined eggs.
Liquid chickens, as my high school best friend once said, which I'm sure is no better.
Right. Foul ectoplasm. That's the new. That's what I'm gonna start calling eggs.
Yeah, but you gotta spell it foul, FOWL, because then it's the perfect pun. Foul.
I was gonna, yeah, okay.
But ching.
Well, Meredith, thank you for coming on to have a conversation with us. Very
thanks for
much
having me.
appreciated.
This has been plenty of fun, and I will definitely talk to Emerson and see if he'd be up for a twofer.
I would love, yes. We're interested. We're very interested in not just the technical, I mean, Grant and Aleph certainly, and I'm a little bit interested in the underpinnings, but also sort of the social movements behind cryptocurrency, behind privacy. We have a lot of conversations about the political natures of them, what's going on in the world, and and I think when you say that it's a genie we're not putting back in the bottle, I think you're 100% right. There are naysayers in the world today. There
are people in the world today that think it's possible to subordinate. Who think it's not only possible but desirable to subordinate mathematics to national sovereignty. And I'm like, I'm sorry, we don't live in the same world.
Well, I can be a heretic when it comes to mathematics, but I didn't want to embark on any of those. My heretical views of math.
Your concepts of zero are strange, Lucas, to say the least.
I desperately want a teach the controversy shirt for the axiom of choice.
A what shirt? What did it say?
I want a teach the controversy T-shirt about the axiom of choice.
Ooh, I can't believe you brought up the axiom of choice. Timbuktu and the axiom of choice on the same day. I haven't even gone there with Grant, but yes, the axiom of choice is a dead horse that's been beaten to death as Aleph put it, like buried in the ground and beaten some more.
Just so you know, before we close, I'm running a Herschel backpack now because Timbuktu bag was actually, even though I could do crossbody, it wasn't. I would always end up with some kind of like lean to compensate, and I decided, if you're not familiar with Herschel, it's like they're a bag manufacturer, but I've decided Herschel, because we're foul ectoplasm. We're being word nerds. I've decided that Herschel is Jan style instead of Jan sport. It's like literally a Jan. It's just like a stylish Jan sport. It's
Nice.
super affordable, But that's what I'm rocking these days. I Timbuktu'd for a really long time though. I think that's a Bay Area thing though. I think like if you go to the Bay Area, I think that like every single baggy pants, clove smoking, turtleneck wearing, hipster is walking around with a Timbuktu bag.
Yeah.
I have
the U.S. in general has yet to discover or appreciate the brilliance of Longchamp, but that's another topic for another time, I think.
Perfect.
Right on. Well, really appreciate having you on the show today, Meredith. Looking forward to the next conversation, and we'll let you go crash out, get some sleep.
All right. Have a great day, you guys.
All right, thanks.
Bye.